The wind, a mournful cantor, swept across the skeletal remains of Blackwood Creek Farm, carrying whispers of desolation and forgotten sorrows. Dust devils danced where a home once stood, their ephemeral forms mocking the charred timbers that lay like broken bones upon the parched earth. It was to this tableau of ruin that Ilara arrived, descending from the battered stagecoach with a weariness that settled deeper than her bones. Her hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of her belly, a silent testament to a future she clutched as tightly as the worn leather satchel in her other hand. Inside that satchel, nestled amongst a few meager possessions, lay a secret, a modest fortune that was both her shield and her only bargaining chip in a world that had offered her little but scorn. She had fled a gilded cage, a future bartered by her father to a man whose touch promised only winter, leaving behind a life of stifling propriety for the raw, unforgiving canvas of the frontier. The stagecoach rumbled away, a diminishing sound that underscored her profound isolation. Before her, the gutted farmhouse, the collapsed barn, the scorched earth, it was a mirror to the barren landscape of her own heart, a place where hope had long been cauterized by betrayal. Yet, as she breathed in the dry, sharp air, a flicker of defiance, small but stubborn, ignited within her. This was not an end, but a brutal, stark beginning. From the shadowed doorway of what looked like a hastily constructed lean-to against the most stable remaining wall of the burned house, a figure emerged, materializing like a specter from the ruins. Josiah! He moved with a pronounced limp, one leg ending abruptly below the knee, replaced by a crudely fashioned wooden peg that struck the earth with a dull, rhythmic thud. His face was a roadmap of hardship, etched with lines of grief and suspicion, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding a coldness that chilled Ilara more than the prairie wind. He was a man carved from the very rock and sorrow of this land, his silence as vast and unnervating as the plains stretching to the horizon. "This is private property," he stated, his voice raspy from disuse, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. There was no welcome, only a stark challenge. Ilara straightened, her chin lifting slightly, though a tremor ran through her. "I was told the land might be for sale. Or perhaps, in need of a partner." Josiah's gaze swept over her, taking in her visible pregnancy, her city-soft hands, the desperation she tried to mask with dignity. A humorless sound, less a laugh than a bark of air, escaped him. "A partner? What would a woman like you offer a place like this, except more trouble?" Ilara's grip tightened on her satchel. She would not beg, but she would fight. "I have resources," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She unlatched the satchel, careful not to reveal its full contents, and extracted a small, cloth-wrapped bundle of coins. She laid them on a scorched tree stump that stood between them. Enough to buy seed, tools, perhaps lumber. Enough to begin again. "I will work. I am not afraid of labor." He stared at the coins, then back at her, his expression unreadable. The ghosts of his past were almost palpable in the air around him, the scent of smoke seeming to cling to his clothes, to his very being. This land had already claimed everything from him. What more could it, or this woman, possibly take? Perhaps it was the unwavering resolve in her eyes, a reflection of a resilience he thought had been extinguished in himself, or perhaps it was the sheer, improbable audacity of her standing there, a pregnant woman offering to resurrect a graveyard. "The work would break you," he said, his tone flat, but the sharp edge of dismissal had softened, almost imperceptibly. Ilara met his gaze. "I am already broken, mister?" "Josiah," he supplied, the name tasting foreign on his tongue. "Then perhaps," Ilara replied, a faint, weary smile touching her lips, "we can piece things back together." Different, perhaps, but whole. He was silent for a long time, the wind his only accomplice, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "There's an old well. Still draws. We'll need water before anything." It was not an acceptance, not truly, but it was not a refusal either. It was a single, fragile thread offered across a chasm of despair, and Ilara grasped it with all the strength she possessed. The vast, indifferent sky watched as two solitary figures, each burdened by their own invisible infernos, stood on the edge of an impossible promise, the ashes of Blackwood Creek their witness. The days that followed bled into a grueling rhythm of relentless toil, each sunrise painting the desolate landscape in hues of stark reality. Ilara learned the language of aching muscles and calloused hands, her earlier life of soft fabrics and polite conversation a distant, almost forgotten dream. She cleared charred timbers alongside Josiah, the acrid scent of old fires filling her lungs, her movements becoming more economical, her resolve hardening with each stone she helped shift, each bucket of debris she carried away. Her pregnancy, a constant presence, was a silent motivator, a reminder of the life she fought to build. Josiah watched her, his initial skepticism slowly, almost imperceptibly, eroding. He never offered praise, his words remained as sparse as trees on the open prairie, but he began to leave a dipper of fresh water where she worked, and once, she found a rusted hoe he had painstakingly cleaned and sharpened, its handle smoothed for an easier grip, left propped against the lean-to. He said nothing, she offered a quiet thank you to his retreating back. Their evenings were spent by a small, crackling fire, the vast, star-dusted sky their only canopy. Shared meals of strong, bitter coffee and day-old bread, eaten in a silence that was no longer entirely uncomfortable, became their ritual. In these quiet hours, the unspoken began to find voice. One evening, as Ilara mended a tear in her worn dress, her needle moving with determined precision, she noticed Josiah staring into the flames, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the flickering light. She dared to break the stillness. The fire, it took much from this place. He didn't look at her, his profile stark against the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, heavy with unshed grief. "Sarah," he said, the name a raw wound. "My wife. And Caleb. Our boy." He was 5-inch. The words hung in the air, each one a testament to an unbearable loss. He recounted the night the flames had devoured his world, a rogue spark from the forge, a sudden prairie wind, the scream swallowed by the roar of the inferno. He'd woken in a haze of pain weeks later, his farm gone, his family gone, a part of his leg gone. The doctor in Redemption Gulch had saved his life, but Josiah often wondered if it had been a kindness. Ilara listened, her own heart aching in sympathy, her needle stilled in her lap. The story of his pain was a somber tapestry, explaining the deep furrows of sorrow on his face, the desolate look in his eyes that had first greeted her. When he fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote, she did not offer empty platitudes. She simply sat with him in the shared space of his sorrow, her quiet presence a balm he hadn't realized he needed. Later, under the soft glow of a lantern as they took shelter from a sudden downpour in the partially constructed frame of their new, small cabin, Ilara found herself reciprocating his painful honesty. She spoke of the oppressive opulence of her father's house, of Barnaby Henderson, the wealthy, older suitor whose cold eyes and possessive demeanor had promised a life sentence of gilded misery. Then, her voice softening, she spoke of Arthur, the young, penniless artist her father had hired to paint her portrait, whose eyes had held not canvas and oils, but dreams of distant shores and a shared future. Arthur, the father of her unborn child, taken by a swift, brutal fever before their secret plans to escape together could ever take flight. Her grief, though different from Josiah's violent sundering, was a quiet, persistent ache, a loss of what might have been. He listened, his usual gruffness softened by an uncharacteristic stillness, his gaze holding a flicker of understanding. On their first necessary trip to the nearby settlement of Redemption Gulch for supplies they couldn't scavenge or fashion themselves, the weight of societal judgment pressed in on Ilara. Whispers followed her like shadows, pregnant, and him with no wife, that recluse Josiah, what's he doing with the likes of her? The stares were sharp, unforgiving. But in the dim interior of the general store, a woman named Martha, the proprietor's wife, with a face as kind as a summer morning and eyes that held no judgment, offered Ilara a warm smile and a cup of chamomile tea. "You look tired, child," she'd said gently, her voice a soothing balm. "This frontier is hard on us all, but hardest on those building anew. That small act of kindness, a single candle in the overwhelming darkness of censure, fortified Ilara more than any provisions they purchased that day." As they journeyed back to Blackwood Creek, the wagon laden with precious lumber and sacks of grain, a fragile tendril of understanding had begun to weave itself between the one-legged rancher and the pregnant outcast, a bond forged in shared labor, whispered griefs, and the silent acknowledgement of each other's scars. The raw-boned frame of the cabin slowly fleshed out, transforming from a skeletal promise into a tangible shelter. Each plank Josiah wrestled into place, each nail Ilara painstakingly straightened and handed to him, was a small victory against the desolation that had once reigned supreme. It was modest, barely 2 rooms, but it stood defiant against the wind, a testament to their combined will. Near the freshly hung door, Ilara carefully planted a few hardy sunflower seeds she'd found tucked away in her satchel, a small act of faith in the future, a splash of improbable color against the gray and brown. Josiah, watching her from the corner of his eye as he mended a piece of harness, felt a strange stirring in his chest, a sensation he'd long thought buried with Sarah and Caleb. He found himself clearing a smoother path for Ilara as her belly grew more prominent, his gaze lingering on her with an unfamiliar softness. He even spent an evening whittling a small, smooth wooden bird, its lines simple but tender, leaving it on the windowsill where she would find it. He never acknowledged these small acts, and she, understanding the language of his reticence, accepted them with a quiet gratitude that needed no words. One evening, as a cool breeze whispered through the newly glazed window of their small cabin, the lantern light casting warm shadows on the rough-hewn walls, Ilara made a decision that had been weighing on her heart. The trust Josiah had shown, not in words but in shared sunrises and silent partnership, deserved the full measure of her own. She retrieved her worn leather satchel from its hiding place beneath her cot. Josiah watched, his expression questioning, as she placed it on the small table between them. With steady hands, she unfastened the buckle and drew out not just the few coins he had seen, but bundle after bundle of banknotes, a sum that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a small fortune, carefully preserved, representing freedom, security, a real chance. "My mother's legacy," Ilara explained, her voice low but clear. "She married my father for duty, not love, and endured much. She wanted me to have a choice, a life of my own making. She entrusted this to me, hidden from my father's greed. She pushed the stacks of money towards him. It's for Blackwood Creek. For us. For the future." Josiah stared at the money, then at Ilara, his eyes searching hers. The magnitude of her trust was a heavy, profound thing, settling upon his shoulders not as a burden, but as a mantle of shared responsibility. For long moments, he was silent, the only sounds the chirping of crickets outside and the soft sigh of the wind. Then, he slowly reached out a calloused hand, not for the money, but to gently cover hers where it rested on the table. He gave a single, solemn nod. It was a vow, more binding than any spoken oath. Their shared dream, once a fragile whisper, now had the solid foundation of true partnership. But the past, as it often does, had long tendrils. Martha, on a visit to bring a basket of fresh eggs and news from Redemption Gulch, spoke of a stranger asking persistent questions in town. A man of means, well-dressed, looking for a young woman named Ilara, painting a picture of her as confused, perhaps even ungrateful, having fled a comfortable life. Ilara's blood ran cold. Barnaby Henderson. His name was a chill wind extinguishing the warmth of their newfound hope. Josiah listened, his jaw tightening, the lines around his eyes hardening into a grim resolve. The quiet life he had sought in his grief was over. The fight he thought he had abandoned with the loss of his family stirred anew within him, a protective instinct fierce and unyielding. The shadow of Barnaby Henderson stretched long and dark towards Blackwood Creek, threatening to engulf the fragile light they had so painstakingly kindled. The confrontation, when it came, was as stark and inevitable as a prairie thunderstorm. Barnaby Henderson arrived not with the subtlety of his inquiries in town, but with the brazen arrogance of a man accustomed to taking what he believed was his. He rode a fine, disdainful gelding, flanked by 2 rough-looking men whose eyes held a mercenary coldness. He reined in before the modest cabin, his lip curling slightly as he surveyed the signs of their hard-won progress, the neat stack of firewood, the sturdy if unpainted walls, the brave sunflowers nodding by the door. His gaze, however, dismissed these efforts, landing on Ilara with a possessive gleam that made her skin crawl. "Ilara, my dear," he called out, his voice smooth, honeyed with a condescension that set Josiah's teeth on edge. "This foolish, rustic escapade has gone on quite long enough. You will pack your things. We are leaving." He didn't so much as glance at Josiah, dismissing him as part of the landscape, an insignificant obstacle. But Josiah was no longer the broken recluse. He stepped forward, his wooden leg thudding with deliberate emphasis on the hard-packed earth, positioning himself squarely between Ilara and her tormentor. "She's not going anywhere," Josiah stated, his voice quiet, yet it resonated with an iron authority that cut through Barnaby's patronizing tone. Henderson finally deigned to look at him, a flicker of surprise, then amusement, in his eyes. "And who, pray tell, are you to interfere in a family matter, my good man? A one-legged guardian?" The sneer was palpable. "I'm the man telling you to leave her be," Josiah retorted, his gaze unwavering. Barnaby scoffed. "She is betrothed to me. An agreement made with her father. She is overwrought, clearly not in her right mind to be living in this." He waved a dismissive hand at the cabin. "I have papers. I can have her committed, declared unfit. The child, of course, will be taken care of, raised appropriately." He made a slight movement as if to dismount, to approach Ilara directly. Josiah shifted, his stance a silent warning. One of Barnaby's men, sensing the shift in tension, took a menacing step forward, shoving Josiah roughly on the shoulder. "Stay out of this, cripple." In that charged, volatile moment, as Josiah tensed to retaliate, a sharp cry pierced the air. "Ilara!" She gasped, her hands flying to her swollen belly, her face paling. "Josiah, the baby, it's coming." The words, desperate and urgent, sliced through the standoff, a primal force eclipsing Barnaby's threats and the simmering violence. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Barnaby looked momentarily disconcerted, his carefully constructed authority faltering in the face of such an elemental, inconvenient truth. His threats of legal papers and societal standing suddenly seemed hollow, absurd, against the raw, undeniable reality of impending birth. It was at this critical juncture that the dust cloud on the horizon resolved into riders. Martha, her intuition sharpened by years on the frontier and a deep-seated distrust of men like Barnaby, had seen him ride out from Redemption Gulch with his hired muscle. She had quickly gathered the sheriff, a man initially inclined to believe Henderson's smooth talk of a runaway ward, and a few other sturdy townsfolk. They arrived now, not as antagonists, but as witnesses, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they took in Ilara's evident distress, Josiah's protective stance, and Barnaby's callous indifference to the woman clearly in the throes of labor. Their presence, solid and observant, was a silent judgment, a barrier against the overt aggression Barnaby's men might have otherwise employed. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, not by force of arms, but by the undeniable cry of life demanding its moment. Barnaby Henderson, for all his wealth and bluster, found himself outmaneuvered by forces he could neither buy nor intimidate, the raw courage of a woman in labor, the unwavering resolve of a man defending his own, and the slowly dawning, collective disapproval of a frontier community. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Elias Thorne who valued grit over gold, stepped forward, his gaze stern as he assessed the scene. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the law, "however rudimentary, it seems the lady is in no condition to travel, nor does she appear to be under any duress, save that which you are causing. I suggest you and your men return to Redemption Gulch, and perhaps consider moving on from there." Henderson's face flushed with anger and humiliation. His threats, once so potent against a lone, frightened woman, were now impotent against the combined strength of Josiah's quiet defiance and the silent, watchful eyes of the townsfolk. With a final, venomous glare at Ilara and Josiah, he wheeled his horse around, his hired men following sullenly. They rode away, their departure a fading shadow, their menace shrinking with distance, leaving behind not victory for them, but a profound, almost sacred stillness. Inside the small, sturdy cabin, the world narrowed to the elemental struggle of birth. Martha, her calm competence a reassuring presence, took charge, her movements practiced and gentle. Josiah, his earlier confrontation with Barnaby forgotten, became a pillar of quiet support for Ilara. He kept the fire stoked, boiled water, his hands, usually so adept with tools and timber, now surprisingly gentle as he wiped Ilara's brow with a cool cloth or offered her his calloused hand to grip when the waves of pain crested. He watched her, his heart, which he thought had turned to stone years ago, aching with an entirely new emotion, a fierce, protective tenderness mixed with an overwhelming awe at her strength. And then, as the first light of dawn painted the prairie sky in hues of rose and gold, a fragile, triumphant cry filled the small cabin. a daughter. Ilara, exhausted but radiant, held the tiny, squirming bundle to her chest. Little Hope. Josiah, at Martha's quiet instruction, carefully cut the cord, his big hand surprisingly steady. He wrapped the infant in a soft, clean cloth Martha had provided, his gaze fixed on the perfect, miniature features, a sense of wonder washing over him. The desolation of Blackwood Creek had, in that moment, been utterly vanquished, replaced by the irrefutable miracle of new life. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet domesticity centered around the tiny, demanding presence of baby Hope. Josiah, initially awkward and unsure around such a fragile creature, found himself inexplicably drawn to her. He learned to hold her, her small head nestled in the crook of his arm, his calloused finger often grasped by her impossibly small hand. He would sit by the cradle he'd fashioned from a smoothed wooden crate, simply watching her sleep, a softness in his eyes that Ilara had never seen before. The cabin, once just a shelter against the elements, a symbol of grim survival, transformed into a home, warmed by shared responsibility, unspoken affection, and the sweet, milky scent of a newborn. The community of Redemption Gulch, their initial suspicions replaced by respect for the couple's resilience and evident devotion, offered gestures of support, a milking goat from one farmer, a batch of freshly baked bread from another, precious seeds for a larger spring garden from Martha. 2 years later, spring had returned to Blackwood Creek with a verdant flourish. The modest cabin still stood, but beside it rose a sturdier, more spacious farmhouse, its porch facing the sunrise. Fields, once barren and scorched, now rippled with young corn and wheat. A few head of cattle grazed peacefully in a newly fenced pasture. Laughter, bright and untroubled as a meadowlark's song, echoed across the yard as Little Hope, a fearless toddler with her mother's wide, intelligent eyes and a mop of sun-bleached curls, chased a fluttering yellow butterfly. Ilara stood on the porch, a contented smile gracing her lips as she watched her daughter. The lines of worry that had once etched her face were softened, replaced by an aura of quiet strength and peace. Josiah came up beside her, his arms settling naturally, possessively, around her shoulders. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, he was no longer the broken hermit of Blackwood Creek, but a man made whole again, his gaze filled with love for the woman beside him and the child who was the embodiment of their shared future. They stood together, two souls who had found solace and redemption in the ashes of their pasts, their silence filled with a profound, unspoken understanding. The prairie wind, no longer a mournful dirge, whispered through the tall grasses, carrying not tales of sorrow, but a timeless song of resilience, love, and the enduring power of hope rebuilt from ruin. What desolate landscapes have you encountered in your own journey, and what seeds of courage did you dare to plant in the unlikeliest of soils? Remember that even when surrounded by the charred remnants of what was, the human spirit, nurtured by love and tenacity, can always choose to build anew, transforming wastelands into testaments of enduring strength and unexpected grace.